Yes,
That is so excited to be here. This is a dream of yours. You told me before we started recording, right? Was that what? Wasn't that your words?
totally. I started by stalking you and then hoped one day you would respond to my messages, and here we are.
I don't believe that. I mean, that's very sweet of you to say, but like you're killing it. I'm so excited to read your book that's coming out, and I'm very, very impressed with the work that you're putting out in the world in our space. And if that is true, it makes a fella feel really good. I gotta say, because I look up to you in the work that you're doing, and if you're sincere, which I have no reason to believe you're not being, Karen, it does mean a lot that you say that.
I am sincere. I don't do platitudes and I don't blow smoke, but I too am a fan. Just from, as I mentioned earlier before we were on the air, I found you through your podcast. And before I even saw who you were and connected with you, it was like, oh, I love the questions you're asking and I love what you're bringing forward. And I love your businesses. So, yeah, completely a big fan and cheering
Thank
you
you.
on.
I appreciate that. And I think it was a while ago when you found the podcast, which also makes me feel really good because you know how these things go. Like you kind of just put your stuff out there and you trust it and you have faith it finds the right people. And every now and then you get validation that it is finding the right people. And that makes me feel really, really good. Because for a long time, I mean, we're still not a big show, but we're doing decent numbers now. But for a long time, it was, very small but specific audience that we were reaching, and so yeah, that makes me feel good that you say that about the show. Um, we got a lot to talk about. How did you get in this space? Let's just start with your background. And I come from the documentary filmmaking world, so that naturally led to storytelling. What's your world? What's your background?
I, in my personal life, told stories, which that's a whole story we can get into. But in work, I was in roles of head of leadership development, head of organizational culture, and in these places where the employees that fell in the businesses I was supporting were like 90,000 employees in 150 countries. And organizational culture doesn't change or evolve or shape unless a person thinks about like, what does this mean for me and what do I want to do? I found stories were such a great way to connect with people that you can never see in front of you and you can never touch, and have them get these experiences that were much more dynamic than just values and think about what
Mm,
to do. So throughout my career, I've been in these positions where I'm trying to persuade people that have budget and maybe two people can say yes, but 98 people could say no. And I found stories slowed their no and it saved the world from boring meetings.
I love that. So you don't just start off going head of leadership development for companies that large. Like, is that the path you intended to take? Like, what was the step before that, or a couple of steps before that?
Yeah, I don't know anybody's on the path they intended to take, but my
No.
background is psychology and how you apply it to work and how you make people perform better. And I started out as an instructional designer, designing adult learning and training in HP,
Mm,
and was a consultant to HP. And then that evolved into, well, there's more than just training, there's performance issues. And then I moved to Deloitte and was
mm,
doing the same thing, and then moved inside the firm to consult to Deloitte on how they were developing talent for the future. And at the time, Deloitte was building a brick and mortar university. And so I got really involved in that, but expanded it into what is that life cycle of the employee from when we're recruiting all the way through when they leave,
mhm.
and how do we think about how to help them be better. And so it just always kept expanding from first how do we help people learn to everything is in learning and what do we do to make it better. And then from Deloitte I went to GE and was in the chief learning officer role and head of culture role and spanned businesses.
Let's go back to earlier. You said something like, I'm going to paraphrase, but you keep me in check if I misrepresent your words and what you said. You said something along the lines of organizational culture doesn't change or isn't created unless someone intentionally does it. Is that fair, or more or less what you were saying?
Maybe not intentionally, because there's a
Okay.
lot of people that behave in certain ways that shape culture that maybe they don't
Interesting.
realize, right? So if
Yeah.
you, let's say someone says an offhand remark in a meeting and nobody addresses it, that then makes that statement okay or
Yeah.
acceptable because no one addresses it. Is that intentional? Maybe, maybe not. But
Mm.
what I find is to intentionally shape it in the ways that we want, you have to bring it front of mind for people and help them recognize, hey, if someone's making an off color remark, You need to stop that. You need to address it. There's ways we can call each other in and make people understand what we want to reinforce.
So why is that so important, right? Because if I'm going to play the business minded devil's advocate here, you know, I want to understand why, you know, what culture, why does culture matter when I'm focused on the bottom line? Why do we need to transform culture or create and establish a culture?
Yeah, I think it's what so many companies are grappling with now. Some of it is in the lens of where are we working? Are we virtual? Are we in person? Some of it is in the lens of how do we restructure our business based on the economy? Um, you can drive to the bottom line, but have a whole lot of casualties on the way because you're pushing people to work beyond any type of balance or anything that's healthy. You're having maybe leaders and teams that are being not at a minimum not having any trust and feeling like people can do the work, but they're nervous about the work. There's no psychological safety, and there's a cost. It's a waste of energy. No, I like to say that energy is our fixed commodity, not time, because we all have the same 24 hours, but we spend them differently based on our interest in our energy. So if you're working in a culture where you don't feel like you can make mistakes, you don't feel like you can push back, you're afraid to admit to something or raise something that you think isn't right, all of that energy is going not to the work, but to managing how to go through the day, which is just a waste of energy. When you have a culture where I do feel like I can say, hey, Rain, I saw this and I'm concerned about it. Let's talk about it. Or I made this mistake. Can we talk about it as a team and think about what to do different and what we learned from it? Or share lessons learned. That energy is now going to the work and not the way work is done. And so these little things are managing the energy, which is our fixed commodity, which creates all the difference in the bottom line. Because if you want to get the most out of your bottom line, you want all your energy going to the work, not to the way work is done.
That's such a great point. And I'm feeling that now with the business that I'm working on. And speaking of that, okay, so we just established the why of transforming the culture. I'm working in a startup right now. We talked about it briefly. I know you're aware. Small team, still very small team. So my next question is when is the time, the ideal time to start having that conversation? Is it when we're scrappy and we have 5 to 6 to 7 people? Is it as you're scaling? Like, when do you have this conversation? Because what I see from my experience is it's very easy for things like that to just get pushed to the side because we're focused, we're trying to survive, we're trying to keep our heads above water, or, you know, figure out the business model.
Yeah. It's true. Most people do push it off because so often as you're growing, you get opportunities to sell your products and services and you are just all in because it's taking every hand that you have. But in that, you often have some bad behaviors. Maybe there's not the place to say, hey, we're concerned here because we're driving so hard to what's happening. And so what you want to do is implement the habit of, maybe it's every day, maybe it's once a week, have a quick stand up of what's working, what's not working. What is one thing we should stop doing? Those three questions are huge. And then if you're in the leadership level, ask, what is something I need to hear but don't want to hear? And really mean it, really mean it. If you can start doing that and create this environment where people can say those things and feel comfortable saying those things, then it's not hard when they say, okay, Rain, let's talk about this. I really didn't like this. And you're like, all right, thank you for telling me. Let's figure it out. That's a whole lot easier than someone not saying anything and that festers. And 2 months from now, it comes out in a larger issue. And now it's not just tweaking a behavior, it's having to do something completely different. So the smaller, shorter habits are going to be so much easier, whether that's 5 minutes a day or once a week. Those quick check-ins will make all the difference and make sure that as you're growing, you are being intentional about what's working and not working.
So in your own journey and the roles that you were filling at these companies, you just started to realize, like, did you bring this knowledge of stories with you from the past, or did you start to just realize it started to reveal itself, like, hey, this is the way that is the most effective when I do this? It was like A/B testing. When I do this, it works. When I do this, it doesn't work.
So when I was a child, I told a story that created a really big shift for me, and it made me realize I can tell stories that are going to not only change perspective but shift energy. So I have a brown eye and a green eye. And the question you get so quickly is, do you know you have two different color eyes? Like, I could see the moment where people would be talking to me and I see their eyes going back and forth, and then they slow, and whatever they're saying comes to a stop, and then it's like, "Did you know?" To which I would be like, "No, really?" And this is my favorite thing about me. It's always made me feel like I was special and I loved it. But after this happening every day and multiple times a day, and then they're like, "Hey, come over here. You got to see her eyes." Like, this thing that you love about yourself becomes this burden,
Mm.
and you become weird for it. And I grew really tired of it. And it always turned into this really elaborate script that ended in, how did that happen? And I told them that I was born with brown eyes, and I was in my room coloring one night. You know, you have that big box of crayons where you have the perfect ones, the broken ones, the peeled
Yeah.
ones. I was coloring, and dinner wasn't going to be for a few more hours. I was hungry, and I took the green crayon and I sniffed it, and it smelled pretty good. And I took a nibble, and it didn't really taste bad, so I ate it. And I liked it. And so I ate every green crayon in the box. And the next day I woke up and my eye was green, and then I be quiet. And every single time people are like, do I believe, like, is she for real? And what happens in this moment is a complete energy shift. It goes from me being this side circus act to being this human. And I let them off the hook of, no, I didn't eat the crayons. But it creates this different energy and engagement. And people would always laugh, and they would realize they had asked me so many ridiculous questions, and it became something that they remembered me for. And it
Mhm.
created this connection that we never would have had if it was just a, "Hi, nice to meet you." And so I recognize in this of, like, these aren't just things that you tell to start a presentation or when you give a toast. It's a way to connect with people differently. So as I move through my career, when I saw leaders who didn't have the approval to say yes, saying no, I would try different stories to expand their thinking, to challenge what they understood, and to see if we could create shifts. And then you start doing it, and it's compounding, as you well know, and you do more of it.
How old were you when you were doing this?
When I told the crayon
Yeah,
story, I
yeah.
think I was 5 the first time I told it, but I've told it my entire life.
This is incredible. Like, we could honestly stop the show right there. Like, that is, that's amazing. I'm
That
blown away by that. That is, yeah, that's incredible. And what you're doing there is kind of like a, I don't know, verbal, mental, psychological judo, if you will.
Yeah.
Judo, you take their momentum and use it against them, kind of. And like you said, all these people are coming at you. But I love it's more heartfelt to say that you've now established this connection, but you totally flipped the script on it there and,
Yeah,
and
I
owned
just want
that.
to comment on one thing. I see a comment that says that's the title of a book, Eating Green Crayons. That is not the title of the book. The book is The Perfect Story, but there is a green crayon on the cover.
Oh, is that what the green crayon is?
Thank you. Yep. It's a subtle, you get it when you read it. But yeah,
Oh no.
yeah, that's
Oh, I
the green
think
crayon.
Brian's saying that is a potential book. That's the
Potential
follow up.
book.
That's
Yes.
your next
Yes.
one.
That's right.
Okay. Well, that leads us to
I've ruined you for the
it's
morning.
just so good. It's so good. All right. Okay. I'm gonna use one of your lines here, sort of influenced by one of your lines. I love the thing to the leader. What's something I don't want to hear, but I should, but I
Mhm.
need to. So, what is something that people in the business space get wrong about stories or storytelling?
The first, I think the most common is that we tell the stories that we want to tell and not the stories that the audience needs to hear. So we have our favorite stories and experiences, our greatest hits of maybe things that happened to us or that we just are tickled by, that, like, oh, let me tell you. But that might not be what is important for your audience to hear. And it ends up being like the uncle at the holiday table, which it's always an uncle for some reason that's like telling their story on script. And when you start with the story, that's going to happen. But when you start with your audience, that doesn't happen,
Mhm.
because you always want to center on who are you talking to, and what is it that you're trying to have them experience and feel? What is it that you're trying to have them do different? What is their mindset today, and what might be a potential obstacle? you might take the same story and tell it differently to every audience you speak to. And that's why the story always starts with the audience.
I want to stay on storytelling and kind of leadership. I mentioned this to you before. For the next little bit, I'm really curious because, and I say this all the time. You may have heard this before of how storytelling is kind of a marketing buzzword, or it gets misconstrued as a marketing tool when it's not. It's a communication tool, and yes, you can use that for marketing and sales, but everything requires communication. Any kind of collaboration and connection with another human is going to require communication. So it can be for anything, like leadership.
Yeah.
The other day or a couple of weeks ago, I gave a storytelling workshop or speech to a client of mine that's an electric company, an electric co-op, and it was a leadership little conference they do once a month. But there were people there from all different parts of the electric company. So there was accounting, there were linemen there, and foremen, there were membership services. I mean, everything that took for this electric company for a couple of counties in eastern North Carolina to run were there, or different, leaders from different departments. So it's not, and there were people that did their social media as well, like the people who I think storytelling gets kind of like misconstrued as it's a marketing thing, use it to make Instagram posts or TikTok videos or email newsletters only, right?
Yeah.
So how do those people, like for example, it doesn't have to be specifically a lineman, right, of a crew, but someone like that's in kind of a more, I don't even know, I don't want to say normal job, that sounds weird, but you know what I mean, not in like speaking and storytelling and filmmaking, not in an art. That's a way we can put it, because it's often like, oh, it's an art. How and why do those types of jobs and those types of employees and employers use storytelling, leverage storytelling to be better leaders, to create better culture? Like, I know this is a big question, but like, let's get into that topic a little bit, when it's not just I'm writing or creating a video or a paragraph that is using a storytelling structure.
So let me give you an example.
Okay.
The Navy SEALs, do you have any idea what their pass rate is for their boot camp training, for their SEAL training?
No, that's a good question.
Ridiculously low. It's like 20%. Really, really hard. And if you go to Coronado, where they do SEAL boot camp, they tell you that they have markers of failure. They can tell by maybe acumen or physical fitness or just energy right away, first day, like they can pick out who is not going to make it through because they've done this so much. They have almost a profile of like, yeah, I know. But they also tell you they can't predict success because they don't know what a potential SEAL is going to be putting together. Like maybe someone is fulfilling a lifelong dream or honoring a loved one, or maybe someone just has really insane grit and is going to make it through. And so while it's really tempting to think we know exactly what you have to do to be a SEAL, we don't. We can weed out some things, but we don't know. You can't prescribe the Navy SEAL has to have these things because we just don't know what they're going to put together. I've used that with leaders to recognize how they need to be developing their people. You don't know what someone is going to put together to meet a desired outcome, to meet a goal. What your job is as the leader is to give the outcome. Here's what we expect of you. Here's what we need you to do. How do you want to get there? Because each person is going to put their strengths together in different ways to get there. I've used that with HR to talk about how we have to be careful with competencies and how we have to make sure that you're not being so prescriptive on what has to go into a job description that you're weeding out people that would be able to get there in different ways. So a story can just broaden perspective and shift thinking, and that has nothing to do with me. Now, it's personal because I'm telling it, and there's a reason why I'm telling it, and I'm going to tell it differently than you would tell it. But you can use these to like crack in a little bit of oxygen to help a group stop and maybe pause or think differently or consider some different things. It's not limited to a stage or any specific big moment. It can really help people just reach a different understanding.
And it's okay to tell personal stories in a professional environment.
Yeah. So what I always say is personal doesn't mean private. Every person has their own privacy barrier of what they're going to tell. Like, I don't really tell stories about my family. Very, very rarely will I. And if I do, it's usually about me and not them. But for other people, they love to tell stories about their family, and that's completely fine. So each person decides what is private, but every story is personal because it's being told by you. You are bringing something to it. Even if you're telling someone else's story, we should have your perspective in it. So you can tell a story about your family, and that is totally fine in business. You can tell a story about someone else, and it's totally fine. The goal is to make it personal and figure out for yourself what's private.
So, at what point in your career did you really understand that did this start as a side thing for you when you really started going into teaching and like spreading the gospel of storytelling, if you will, separately from using it in your own profession?
I was always using it in my profession. Then at a certain point, I started to get asked, can you do a session for our customers and clients in some of the different companies I was in? Because they're like, how do you do this? Can we do this as a nice special incentive for them? And then more leaders started asking me inside Deloitte and GE, how do I do this? And how do you break it down? And then the big catapulting piece is when my talk went on TED.com, that exploded, and that became much more of an interest from companies on let's break this down, because we do recognize this isn't just a marketing thing. This is going to help our engineers communicate their data more effectively and help our finance be a little more creative and help HR connect with people in different ways. And people are recognizing, especially in this changing world, this is such a helpful way to get communication. This is a core leadership skill. So the TED Talk was a big catapulter into let's really help people break down how to do this and make it accessible.
And that wasn't that long ago, right? When
Yeah, I did the talk in 2020, the week before the world shut
I was
down.
about to say,
And then,
fun.
yeah. And then January 2021, TED put it on TED.com, and then it just took off.
That's so awesome.
Yeah.
How did that feel?
Wild.
Yeah.
It grew very quickly. And then when things happen that quickly and that big, you get all sorts of messages. People like reaching out from all over the world, sharing their stories, their problems,
No.
wanting help. Like it just was wild. It still is. I still get messages
It's
today that I just think is like so cool when people take a moment to reach out. I mean, I'm sure you feel this with the podcast too.
Yeah, and I also had something similar to that years ago. I wrote a piece. The first thing I ever got paid for writing was for the Huffington Post, and it was a little bit controversial, but in a heartfelt, like it served a bigger purpose. It wasn't just to be provocative, but it shook up my little small town in eastern North Carolina. But I still get very sweet messages about that piece, and yeah, it's like you want to. It's not. I was gonna say it's a gift and a curse, but I think that's too harsh to say that. It is definitely more of a gift completely.
Did you feel when that happened, did you feel almost like people coming into your energy? Like you could almost feel a physical
Yeah,
interaction with people you haven't met? Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, that's the
absolutely.
piece of storytelling I don't think people get. Like, even when you're telling something or sharing something at one time, people
Hmm.
feel it later and you somehow experience that. It's a very weird woo thing, but is very true.
Absolutely. And so I'm assuming I want to talk a little bit about the book since that's coming out soon. I'm really
Yeah.
excited about that, especially now that I know the origin of the green crayon.
You do. You're
Did
on the inside secret.
Yes, and everyone else and the world listening right now.
Yes. Now, yes.
But I also really love the simple cover. Like the cover is choice, very well done.
Thank you.
But even better now that I know the little wink wink behind the image. I'm assuming, like, was that already in the works in your mind, or did the TED Talk really push that into existence?
It's a interesting, I reflect on this a lot. So 2020, we went into summer, we're in the pandemic. The talk had gone on the TEDx site, but wasn't on TED.com.
Mhm.
And that summer, things were a little slower for me. And so I started reaching out to people that I knew in different ways to interview them because I remember saying to each person, I don't know exactly how I'm going to use this. I would love to use it in a book as like an interview vignette or a piece of an article, but I'm
Mhm.
not exactly sure. So there was something, and I had an outline, but it wasn't this active, like, I'm working on this book.
Right.
But within week of the talk going on TED, I had agents knocking on my door and I was like, well, I have an outline, let's go. And
Ah,
then those interviews grew and I added more. And so at the end of each chapter, there are these fun interview vignettes that are a chance to walk in the shoes of people that tell stories in different ways. So, like an executive producer of The Moth, or someone that worked at Pixar, or even a physician, or a guy that writes stories for video games. Like, you get their world for 500 words, which is just fascinating. And it shows there are so many ways to do this.
that's helpful because I knew that it was something like that.
That's
Just
like
from
just a
seeing the press.
very small palate cleanser at the end of the chapters. The rest of the
Yeah.
book takes you through the whole process.
What are the common threads between the different types of storytellers that emerged?
They learned to become great. It wasn't like they came out and had the most perfect stories to tell right away.
Yeah.
Most of them have a very strong hand in editing because they
Oh.
recognize that they have to really work at their stories. And in fact, we share, one of the people I interviewed was Dr. Paul Zak, who's just a delight to the storytelling community, and we are all fans of. And he talks about how in some of his articles, he will do like 70 versions, which I
Wow.
heard and wanted to throw up. And then at the same time, it was like, okay, get it. This is what it takes sometimes
Yeah.
to really zero in on stuff. Yeah, go
And
ahead.
that's probably a reason why, like, when I first was like, I've been a storyteller because my background is in filmmaking, but I didn't really start use like working in that space and calling it that until I don't know 2017 or so. And so when I was like diving in and immersing myself into the space, learning as much as I could because I knew I wanted to start kind of helping my audience with that based on my perspective and experience as a documentary filmmaker. I'm just researching, reading, listening to podcasts, articles, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's a reason why when you just start Googling storytelling, Dr. Paul Zak's, content and Harvard Business Review articles kind of rise to the top there. That's probably one of the reasons is that he put that much, effort and energy into writing, great pieces.
Well, and I think what is so interesting about his work is that he reinforces this idea that it's not enough to tell a story. The way you tell one makes a difference in how it's experienced. And so, like, one of my pet peeves is when people say, we're hardwired for stories. No, we are not. If we were, every story would be the most engaging, captivating thing. But a lot of stories are terrible. It's not that we're hardwired for stories, it's that you can tell a great story that takes advantage of the brain and dynamically leverages these things there. But when people say we're hardwired for stories, to me that's like saying I'm hardwired to run a marathon. Like, sure, but if I don't train, it's
Yeah.
going to be awful. And so I think that he's really doing some interesting things in the neuroscience piece that help us see where it's evolving and how you can really captivate, which is just fascinating.
He's also just such a sweet guy. Like
Such
he's
a
so
nice
nice,
guy.
and he wrote a blurb for my book. I think he did for yours as well.
Yeah.
And
He's so
I
supportive of the entire
yes,
storytelling community.
totally. Like he didn't have to do that for me. Like
Right.
even when I
Same.
first reached out to him, I was just starting the podcast. He was like my first big guest that I was like, oh man, like I was super excited about. Everybody else before that, no shade to them, that they were just like local filmmakers that I knew, right? And I could just be
Yeah.
like, hey, so and so, come on my show. But I like crafted an email for him, and I was so excited. But I've seen him the way he acts since then, and you just said the word. He's so supportive. I've seen him commenting and shouting out plenty of people in the space. Very sweet. I want to take a moment, and we're giving him his flowers. But since we had talked about this before and you've used this platform, talk to
Yeah.
me just briefly about immersion and how you've used it. What exactly it is for those listening, because I think it's really important because it's such a cool platform. But I had never really understood how it worked, if you don't mind.
I don't mind. And I don't work for the company. So if I misrepresent
Not
anything,
an
I
ad.
apologize. So Dr. Zak is a co founder of Immersion Neuroscience. And this is the idea that you can measure really the economics of attention, meaning how immersed is someone in something and what is the predictability of them taking action, spending money, or whatever. So if you think of a movie trailer, is the movie trailer put together and edited in such a way that you were like, we need to buy tickets today? Or is the song, really interesting and engaging. Speeches from leaders. You can see
Mhm.
where are you losing your audience, where aren't you? So they use smartwatches to measure capillary changes in the skin, and they can go moment to moment to see where are the oxytocin levels rising and dopamine, where's that cocktail um, humming, where there's engagement, and you can actually see, and where does it fall off. So I did license the platform for a period of time. And one of my very early tests was I was on the phone or I was on a Zoom with someone and I was measuring myself, and we're having this conversation, having a good time. And then the internet cut out. And I went to go, she joined back in. It was fine. I went to go look at the report at the end, and it was all really high, really engaged. So they use color systems. So it was all very green, very positive. And then there's this moment where it just completely cuts out. And I had to go back and look at the call. The moment where it cut is the moment where the internet went out. And so what happens with the oxytocin and dopamine is that we don't will it. The levels are elevated when there's connection, when there's trust, when there's empathy, all of these things that are happening when there is engagement and story. And so the platform is a way for any person to be able to measure this and predict what is the likelihood of someone taking action or making a decision or making an investment, like all of those things. So now if you're a big retailer, it's a lot less risk. You can plan the economics of, is this working the way we want? Can we run some different tests and see what is going to create the most engagement?
Hmm. Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, that's so exciting. They're doing amazing work there. I want to go back to, you had said something about, the we're hardwired for stories, and there's a lot
Do
of
you
these.
like that? Or
Yeah,
okay.
what?
You don't claim that, do you?
I probably did at one point, but I've learned, I've grown,
Yeah.
this is how we progress as people. No, I mean, I usually fall in like, I typically can see both sides. I understand what people are saying when they
Right.
say that, but
Right.
you're 100% right. Like, it doesn't just mean I can wake up and do it. I think the way I would probably flip it is, we all have the capacity to tell great stories and or be creative. When I was talking to the linemen,
Mm-hmm.
at the electric company, they don't consider themselves creative or storytellers. And then I just flipped it to them and was like, well, it's not telling a story like this fluffy, heartfelt thing. It's like, tell me about a time when there was a problem that you overcame. And then they did it perfectly. I'm like, yeah, you just told me a
Right.
story. And if you're trying to inspire the people working for you, that's what you would do. So, yeah, I think the marathon example was really good. Like, yeah, your body can do it if you train for it. It can't do it today.
You
I
would be
can't.
in a world of hurt if
Yeah,
you
listen,
did.
I play soccer every week. I'm pretty fit, at least from cardiovascular perspective. I ain't getting out there and running 26.2 today. Not a
Right.
chance. Not a
Right.
chance.
Right.
So absolutely. But I want to dig into a little bit of these kind of cliches and tropes, since you kind of, tipped your hat in that direction.
Yeah.
And I've been starting to look at that and see some of these, the people in our space that we know, that we love,
Is this
right?
where we start talking smack?
Well,
I'm
why
just
not? A
kidding.
little bit. Let's go. No, I want to
Yeah.
poke holes in, because who I serve, and I feel like you're the same way as the people,
Yeah.
realistically, right? I
Yeah.
always try to fight for the underdog. And so I often worked with nonprofits, small business owners, because I come from a documentary background. To me, what that means, and why I speak to the people I speak to, is like, it's overwhelmed and under resourced, right? Like, you're always playing catch up. You don't have huge budgets, you don't have huge teams, and so therefore, I'm looking at like simple ways to help people understand the effect of storytelling, and then the simple structure of how to like execute it, right?
Yep.
Like I told the lineman, this is just talking about overcoming a problem and how you did it and what was the resolution of that, the transformation that that happened.
Agree.
So I take issue with some of the you know um, more common approaches, structures. I mean, hero's journey, for example.
Let's go to the
Let's go
hero's
to.
journey.
I used
Yeah.
this the other day because I showed someone the diagram, and I'm like, it's 17 steps.
Yeah.
If you're out there, and let's go back to social media and marketing. If you're creating a TikTok video or an Instagram post today, you're telling me that it's for a normal person who's got limited budget. They're a one person marketing team. They're executive directors, like wanting them to make a viral video, and they're gonna be like, okay, what is the call to adventure? What is the all of these
Yeah.
like really dense and nuanced moments? And the abridged version of the hero's journey is 12 steps, right?
Yeah.
So it's just
Yeah.
wild to expect normal people that aren't trying to be Shakespeare or Christopher Nolan or whatever, like to use something that complex. This is what Star Wars was based off of, one of the most successful movies of all time. You don't need to do that to be an effective leader or an effective communicator, in my humble opinion.
Agree. I find that one of the challenges in getting leaders to use storytelling is they hear in the zeitgeist, you use the hero's journey. This is the model. There's a few problems with it. It's very prescriptive, and not every story fits neatly into it. Like, who's my guide on the side? I don't have one. And so they get to the point where they can't back their story into the pieces and they give up. So that's problem one. Problem two, I make so many mistakes that make so much better stories than a hero's journey. Not everything is nicely tied up in a bow. Um, I always say to leaders, like, you're not writing a screenplay, you're trying to land an idea in a meeting. So let's give you a basic framework that you can use in any setting, and then let's show you different levers you can pull to engage the brain however you want to do it. The more complicated things like the hero's journey just raise the risk of people abandoning it because they don't know how to make their story fit, or they don't see their story fitting, or they have a story that isn't about a hero. And so to make it accessible, feel like you have to give people approaches that are really accessible.
Such a good point, and I didn't really even think about it like that, but I know it to be true as soon as you said it. Like when they follow a model that strictly, and then they run into a block, a wall, they don't know how to get around that because they might not have that part in their story, right? You might not have a mentor or a guide, right?
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean you don't have a story just because you don't. So I think that's such a good point. If you try to stick too rigidly to a structure like that because you've been told by people like us, time and time again that you should use that. Yeah, that's a limiting factor for sure.
I personally can't keep my place in it. Like, I'm always like, what step are we on?
Well, that's
What
what I'm
comes
saying. It's too
next?
it's
Yeah,
too
too much.
complex and
Agree.
convoluted,
Yeah.
and so that's I put it up and just kind of let people look at it. I'm like, this is wild. I do this for a living, and I'm not sitting there writing my screenplays and stories with the hero's journey.
Yeah.
Right. And
Yeah.
furthermore, this is a slippery slope. I don't necessarily want to go down this path, but there's a lot of those people creating these structures and models, and this happens a lot in screenwriting, like what you should do and the exact formula you should follow, that aren't working storytellers or screenwriters, right?
Yeah.
They're just people talking about structure. And I know people need structure, but at
Yeah.
the end of the day, I think it's more about understanding the simple concepts and then just getting out there and doing it. Like you said, like you have to train it.
Agree. I think Pixar has a really elegant model, but people struggle with that in business too, because it's a little bit of the same thing of it. It can feel like it's forcing you in a direction it doesn't. However, I say to people, the model that works is the one that works for you. If Pixar works for you, amazing, use it. If the hero's journey works for you, amazing, use it. Recognize that those are very specific stories that are going to follow the same. There's a reason why every Pixar movie has the same formula and
Right.
same thing, right? So eventually you will want to evolve to tell different types of stories, but whatever works is what works for you.
Mhm.
And if you're not sure how to get started, start with a really simple formula and then play with the pieces that help you make it more interesting and engaging.
Love that. Um, what can people expect from this book? We've talked about it a little bit. And specifically, I'm trying to get at, like, I know that there's a lot of storytelling books out there, right?
Yeah.
I'm in this space too. I wrote one of them, and I see all the, not competition, but just the different perspectives and approaches to this work that we do. What's your unique approach? What can they
What
see there that they can't see somewhere else?
Yeah, what I'm trying to do is evolve the conversation by really helping people understand the science and new science differently. I feel like when you understand what's happening in your brain, not in a science class way, don't worry, you won't be putting on a lab coat. It's fun and light, but I feel like when you understand that differently, you then will start to understand different things you can lean into and different choices you can make in your story. So the science builds on this idea that it's not enough to tell a story. The way you tell one makes a difference. And I have what I call the 5 factory settings of the brain, which break down the science differently to show you these are almost principles of how your brain is going to respond to information versus stories and what to do in your stories with them. So that underlies throughout the book. And then it's taking you through a storytelling process from how you find ideas to getting clear on your audience to a basic story structure to then how you are pulling on all those things that engage the brain from sequencing to senses, emotions, all of that goodness. It goes into storytelling with data, which is incredibly important. And it gets into the mistakes in storytelling, how to avoid manipulating, and what to do to navigate the vulnerability.
What the five factory? What do you
Settings of the brain.
send?
Yeah.
Can we
Yeah.
dive into that a little bit?
Sure. Do you want all five?
What
It's a little meaty.
is it?
Yeah, let's start with the first couple because they
All right.
relate to each other. So the first one you're going to recognize because it's based on the research from Dr. Paul Zak. It is the if you think about the nights that you come home from a really long day and you think like, I do not want to think, I don't want to make decisions. I'm just going to turn on the show that I've seen before, my favorite movie, my favorite show, and just binge because I don't want to think.
Yeah.
Or you're in a meeting and your mind drifts off, and it's because your brain is lazy. And our brains are using the most calories out of any organ in our body. Most of those are going to making predictions for how you move your body and how you stay alive. And your brain never wants to go bankrupt of calories because if it goes bankrupt of calories, you're not alive. So it's always looking for how it can conserve calories. And one of the ways it does this is the second factory setting, which is we regularly make assumptions. So our brain hates for things to be incomplete and it hates to react because if you're reacting to something, you're spending more calories than if you're responding. So your brain is continually making assumptions about the world around you, but also what people are saying, where the movie's going, what the book is doing. And so if you look at these two, you can start to recognize, okay, so as Dr. Zak said, people either pay attention to you or they'll watch cat videos. So you have to think about how am I structuring my story? What unexpected events am I putting into this to make the brain spend calories? How am I making sure that I'm either leaning into assumptions that it's something familiar to what the person knows, or maybe I'm planting a fully formed idea in their head, or I'm challenging assumptions. So those are the first two. I'm going to pause before I go forward, but you can start to see these are things that help you recognize like, oh yeah, I can just keep in my head, the brain is lazy. How do I make it spend calories when I'm constructing a story? And that's probably going to help me pull in a few more things that they'll indeed help it pay attention.
I mean, personally, I'm interested in 3, 4, and 5, but
Yeah,
if you're up for it,
I'm
I
up for
also know
it.
you may have to get the book to get the real answer for this, folks.
Yeah, you will. But three builds on one and two. So first is
Okay.
your brain is lazy. Second is that it's making assumptions.
Mhm.
Part of the assumption making is how we are processing information.
Mhm.
So if you think about when you take a photo on your phone and you swipe up, you see the date, the location, the f-stop, the aperture, like all that is stamped on the photo without you doing anything.
Mm.
Your brain does something similar when you're taking information through your senses. It stamps it with emotions. It stamps your experiences with emotions and it stores it in your long term memory. So when your brain goes to make these predictions and assumptions, it's calling on what I call the library of files, which is the third factory setting that we each have this library of files of experiences and understanding. So when you're telling a story, you want to connect to what people know. You want to connect to what that understanding is in the library of files, or you want to place a fully formed idea. If I describe something as like the paperclip was the scar was the size of a paperclip, you immediately get an image of that without having to think like, how big is that?
Yeah.
I'm taking what you know in your brain and just putting that fully formed thing in there and getting free thinking. So when you are writing stories, you want to connect to what people know, but you also want to help them remove the cognitive load by placing these images or these concepts that are just going to immediately take up space in their brain.
Mm.
The fourth is that we naturally seek in groups and out groups. So, in groups are people groups that we share similar values, aspirations, hopes. There's a sense of belonging and comfort. And out groups are a group that we just feel noticeably different from. So, in an in group, You notice this when you walk into a room, maybe at a networking event, and you're like, who's my person? Who feels comfortable? There's a couple reasons for this. Of when we feel a sense of belonging like that, we feel that oxytocin increase, and it sends a silent signal to our brain of these people or this person is safe to be around, or I feel comfortable. And so when you're telling a story, you have a choice to think about, is my story trying to make someone feel like a member of an in group?
Hmm.
Or is my story trying to make someone feel different, which is what nonprofits and charities do? We're undergoing a hurricane right now, and there's going to be tons of stories about individuals that have lost homes or loved ones. And you hear the story of an individual while you're sitting in air conditioning, drinking, a
Yep.
drink with ice in it, and you
Mm-hmm.
realize, oh my gosh, I am so different than that. And that sometimes motivates you to donate. And so it's not that in groups are good and out groups are bad. It's that, are you trying to have someone feel like, yes, I know that, I want that, I am that, or
Mm-hmm.
wow, I'm different, or both? In a job interview, you're doing both. Here's how I am similar and complement what you do and add value to the team, but here's the differences, the new experiences that I add, how I'm going to elevate your think. How do you do both? Because that can be in the same story. And then the last is, we're this neurochemical cocktail. At the most simple level, we seek pleasure and avoid pain. Pleasure cocktail is the oxytocin, the dopamine, the serotonin, all these feel good chemicals.
Mm-hmm.
And the pain, or the focus, the ones that we want to release for focus, are adrenaline and cortisol. And we know through stories that we do experience this neurochemical shift. And so you also have this choice of, am I telling this feel good story, or am I
Mm-hmm.
telling a story that's uncomfortable? So the opening story of my TED Talk is about someone dropping their phone down an elevator shaft. That was intentionally uncomfortable to take you through that moment into this realization. So now you've got these five, and you start to recognize, wow, okay, I want the brain to spend some calories and not be lazy. And I want to maybe slow down assumptions. I want to connect to what they understand in the library of files, because that's going to influence the decisions. And I want to maybe make them a member of an out group in this case, or an in group. And this is a feel good, or this is an uncomfortable story. And so you start to see, like, there's so many different things here that you can stop and consider when you're building your story, to think about, what is that experience I'm creating for the audience?
I'm so glad that you thank you for giving that to me and
Yeah.
to my listeners. Um, I'm really excited about the book now. I'm trying to think of a nice way to say this, not to you to like I do this work so much. You're probably the same way, that like there a lot of the storytelling books, I support them. I try to model myself after Dr. Paulzak. But I know the content so much, and you see a lot of it regurgitated, that it's like it's been a while since I've been excited about a quote unquote storytelling book. But
Thank
after
you.
you gave that insight, like this makes me so excited. It's October 3rd, right?
It is. That means a lot, because what I really didn't want to do is put out another book on storytelling. And of course, we all have our own approaches, so there will
Totally.
be things that others do. But I really did want to evolve the conversation, because I do see a lot on the science, but it's things like neural coupling, which are fascinating to hear. Oh, my brain activity is similar to yours as
Mm-hmm.
a storyteller. But what do I do with that when I'm telling a story? And so I wanted to give people, I wanted to take complicated science and make it not complicated, so that you could think like, am I telling a feel good story or an uncomfortable story? And no, there's a whole bunch of
Yeah.
science behind that, so that you can play with your stories.
That comes across so clearly, like when you talk, and even of course now when you gave us the five factory settings. That's exactly how I would summarize it. It's like you're totally focused on the science, but not in a way that's like not off-putting, but just kind of like hard to connect with. Like you
Yeah.
you you deliver it in a simple way that people can understand, and so it's important, because that's the why it works. It's important to know that.
Yeah.
But even myself and other people sometimes just kind of skip, you just touch on that. Like I even say in my presentations, when I go into the neuroscience section, which is important, I tell people, hey, I won't nerd out too long, because I could talk about this forever. I'm excited about it, but I won't stay too much on the science. and you go the completely opposite. You're like, no, we're going to stay here, but I'm going to make it easy for you to understand, and I'm going to show you why. And I just like, I am genuinely
I'm
very
always like,
excited.
everybody stretch. We're going to science and it's not
Mhm.
going to hurt. Let's go.
And it's not gonna hurt. I love that. I think it's a perfect place to stop for today because it just teed up myself and everyone else listening to want to go get the book. So October 3rd, it comes out on all platforms, I'm assuming.
Yep.
Congratulations, by the way, too. I'm so proud of you and
Thank
excited
you.
for you. Like you deserve every bit of it. I love your take on everything. And you said some very sweet things to me, which mean a lot. But I completely feel the same way, and not just in a reciprocal, like, "Oh no, you're the best" type of way.
No,
Like,
you.
no, I love your denim jackets.
That means a lot, truly. And I'm so joyed to be able to be here with you.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you so much for your time today. See ya.